All right. Yo, 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 yo. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the new Cocoa Heads meetup. Woo-hoo! All right. Louder, louder. All right. So, guys, welcome. So, if you haven't noticed, you are in a room with a lot of iOS Mac developers. This is Cocoa Heads LA. We are the LA branch of Cocoa Heads, which is an international organization of Mac and iOS developers. So today is going to be a pretty good event. So we're going to have 3 talks. First, Jared's going to talk about Fleet. So to make iOS testing easier, I'm going to talk about API Gateway, how to automate JSON parsing and kind of integrate with that system there so you can focus on your UI. And we're going to have lightning talk over here by Edward about beacons. So he worked on an awesome project, and he wants to share it with you. So so we can see some cool code with beacons. So that's pretty much it. Now I want to kind of give mic back to Jared, and he's gonna just get it going with Fleet. So give him a round of applause and let's start.
Thank you, Alex. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for attending tonight. And a big thank you to Alex for bringing Cocoa Heads back to Pivotal. It's really great to have it back in the space. Again, my name is Jared Friese, and I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about testing in iOS with Fleet. Now, Fleet is a framework that I wrote to address a couple issues that I felt a lot in trying to test drive my iOS applications. In particular, Fleet provides tools for injecting into storyboards and faking out elements in storyboards that you might easily unit test storyboard stuff. And the second thing is that it provides a suite of more natural, more expressive, and more idiomatic helper methods to help interactions with UIKit go over more smoothly. Sorry about that. Y'all see that? All right. Again, my name is Jared Friese, and I work for Pivotal. They're providing the space tonight. And Pivotal's mission is to transform the way the world builds software. And my particular role in this mission is as an engineer in Pivotal's Labs division. And at Labs, we provide consulting services. And we help our clients transform the way that they build software by injecting into their teams a hyper-collaborative mix of user-centered design, pair programming, and test-driven development. And that last piece, test-driven development, we're going to touch on a bit tonight. So, how many of y'all write tests for your iOS applications? Great, I see a couple like this. Oh, we'll count that. So, it's important to ask ourselves, why do we write tests at all? And oftentimes when we ask ourselves questions like these, we want to subject this to a cost-benefit analysis. We want to ask ourselves, what's the cost of writing tests, and what do we get from that? So let's focus in on that cost part first. Generally, you want to think about how much is it costing you to write your tests as you make a determination of how much tests you're going to write, where you're going to write them, what you're going to focus on, etc. And generally speaking, tests cost your team time that you're spending on code that you're not going to ship to users. At least I hope that your test code doesn't end up in the hands of your users in the end. But yes, when you're testing your code, it's time that you're not spending adding new features and refactoring your existing code to make it more pleasant to live in. The second cost that we are paying when we write tests is time and effort that we spend trying to reshape our production code to make it more what's called testable. And I know that this is a very different experience for a lot of people. When I first started writing tests, and when I first started with TDD, test-driven development, writing my tests and letting that guide my production code, I know that it dramatically shaped the way that I wrote my production code. And that was a skill that I had to learn, and in some sense I had to relearn how to do some things. And what I found is that there were some benefits to doing that, even though there was a cost. So let's talk about the other side of that cost-benefit analysis of why and when to write tests. and talk about the benefits. Whenever you pay a cost, I hope you're buying something with that investment, and you certainly are when you write tests. Generally speaking, tests, the time and effort you spend and invest into them, buy your team confidence. Confidence in knowing that that new feature that you added, or that big refactor that you did not introduce regression into your production system, did not make your experience for your users worse. Another thing that you get from your tests is design pressure. This is the other side of that cost that I was talking about a second ago. You'll find that when you write your code to make it more testable, it's going to guide you towards smaller classes that are written more functionally for the sake of making it easier to test. And finally, tests give your team living documentation. And what I mean when I say living documentation, I mean documentation that gets compiled and run alongside and against your actual production code, which allows someone who's new on your team, or you, 6 months after you write some piece of code, to go back and look at the tests for that and make sense of what that thing is doing. So, as with any decision, you want to ask yourself, how much does it cost to write your iOS code? We're not here to talk about software generally tonight. We're Cocoa Heads. We're here to talk about iOS and Mac development. And I want to focus on the question of how much does it cost to test your iOS code? And I bet that when you think about this, when you think about what you want to invest your testing in, you have something like this kind of happening in your brain, where you have that suite of benefits that we talked about, and you're weighing it against that suite of costs that we talked about. And what I came here tonight to talk to you about is Fleet. Fleet is a framework I wrote to help make that right side of this equation, that set of costs, go down a little bit more. And so if you use Fleet, and it's completely open source, I'm hoping that your experience with testing can look a little bit more like this. So the two major gripes, and I've already touched on it, but we'll just crystallize it here, that a lot of people have with testing in iOS is testing storyboards, and especially the segues in those storyboards, and thoroughly and expressively testing UIKit interactions. And again, Fleet offers tools to address both of these. Let's start digging into it. Number one, testing storyboards, especially testing segues. Let's talk about what life looks like for a lot of people, and including myself, before I started writing Fleet and using Fleet. So, we might all be familiar with storyboards. They're nice to work with. They give us a visual way to develop. What you're looking at actually is the storyboard that I have in the Fleet project that I use to develop Fleet. Let's talk about a pretty simple feature that we want to add as an example. When the user taps a button on the screen, we get taken to another page. This is something that anyone who's worked with iOS, I'm sure, has done this a million times, and I'm sorry for the tiny text. But imagine that we have a view controller, the menu view controller. We got strawberry, chocolate, and vanilla. And when I tap on the chocolate button, I want to be taken to the recipe view controller, where I can look at the chocolate recipe. How would you test this? I can tell you the way I would have tested it in the past, again, before I started writing Fleet and before I started using Fleet. I might have written a test kind of like this. Again, I hope that that's not too small for the folks in the back. So this is a pretty standard test that we have here. Test that the button's tapped, we go to the next screen. So I set up my storyboard, and I have my view controller that I instantiate by grabbing the main menu view controller identifier from that storyboard. That's the view controller I want to test. And then I do something that I want to make this segue trigger. In our case, it was a button. And then finally, this is that first attempt at actually testing that our segue works correctly. Let's assert that some title content appears correctly on the view controller that appears. Now this seems fine, and I've written this test plenty of times and had it work. However, let's put it under some scrutiny. What happens when we change the title of the view controller we transition to? That is, I had this view controller, this is the one under test. I have a segue that goes to this view controller, right? What happens when this view controller's title changes? Unfortunately, we're gonna have to remember to come back to this test. Remember, this test over here that we're trying to unit test in isolation of everything else, we're going to have to remember to come back and change it. And that's a bummer. When I'm UI testing my main menu view controller, I don't want to have to worry about content changing on a recipe controller. It's incidental. Second piece of scrutiny is what happens when multiple view controllers with different content happen to have the same title. Now maybe your iOS application doesn't look like this, but I've worked on teams before where we had big storyboards, and some of those storyboards happen to have view controllers with the same title. And what we end up with in this is a situation where we are exposed to accidentally having my main menu view controller and then these two controllers with the same title connecting a segue to the wrong one and having our test pass, but our production code broken. That's not what we want. Yeah, we'll have to pay special attention to both the implementation and the test code to make sure we don't cross wires. This is expensive stuff to have to think about when all I want to do is test that when I tap a button that I segue correctly. All right, I know. I've worked around this before. Here is attempt number 2. So the setup of the code looks the same. I instantiate my storyboard. I grab the view controller I want to test from that storyboard. I do the same thing where I call the segue. This time, I'm going to check that the view controller that I present after the segue finishes is of the right type. This seems better, right? Like then, you know, title content changing on that guy doesn't really matter and it all seems fine. The problem is, what happens when we have different segues transitioning to the same type of view controller? What happens when we reuse our view controllers? Reusing code, what a concept. We're in trouble here because we again expose ourselves to accidentally hooking up a segue to the wrong part of a storyboard. And our tests won't catch this because all we're doing is we're testing the correct usage of a segue by the type of a view controller we happen to go to. The problem here is that these types of tests are content-driven rather than behavior-driven. When I want to test that I tap a button or interact with something on my view controller and a segue fires that's correct, the segue is what I care about. Knowing that I interact with that segue collaborator is really the important thing. I don't want to have to worry about the particular details of this view controller that I end up going to. So how can Fleet help with this? Here is the example code using Fleet. You can see we do the same thing as we did before, get the storyboard, get the view controller under test from that storyboard, and here's where Fleet comes in. With Fleet, we do this thing called mocking the identifier. So we mock the identifier of the destination of the segue, and Fleet mocks that thing out, returns us the mock, and guarantees that when that segue gets called by your test code, as part of your test code, you're going to get this mock back, not the real thing. Perform that segue, and then all we have to do is see that what we present, the result of that segue, ends up being that mock. So let's put this method under the same scrutiny that we did the other method. What happens when we change the title of the view controller we transition to? Doesn't matter. We mocked that collaborator. We don't have to worry about that anymore. What happens when multiple view controllers with different content have the same title? Doesn't matter. We mocked it. We're testing the main menu view controller and its usages of its segues. And we've mocked the behavior of that segue, given ourselves direct access to that in test. We no longer have to worry about the content of that stuff that our segues transition to. Finally, what happens when different segues transition to the same type of view controller? Doesn't matter. We don't have to worry about that because Fleet lets us concern ourselves only with the segue that we're using and not whatever that segue happens to transition to. So the question you want to ask yourself is, how much does it cost to test your segue code? Are you having to worry about the particular content of what you're segueing to? Or do you just get to worry about a unit test for a view controller concerning itself with how its controls use its segues? By allowing you to mock out the particulars, the collaborators of an individual view controller in a storyboard, as you do any other component in any other testing framework that lets you mock, Fleet lets you get a little bit